On a pitch-black night, miles over the Indian Ocean, a fire rages aboard a fully loaded Boeing 747. 140 panicked passengers rush to the front of the plane, hoping to escape the suffocating smoke. The pilots entered a harrowing plunge, urgently attempting to land their aircraft. Will they be able to reach a little island in the midst of the ocean, or will the flames destroy their chances? This is the terrifying account of South African Airways Flight 295, with a strange twist. On the night of November 27, 1987, 140 passengers and 19 staff members boarded a South African Airways Boeing 747 at Taipei, Taiwan. They were headed for Johannesburg, South Africa, with a layover in Mauritius. This was a long journey, with a 10-hour flying duration to Mauritius. To this day, the true narrative of Flight 295 remains cloaked in mystery and conspiracy. Key persons dispute what transpired on the plane when it flew over the southern Indian Ocean. And that's because, from the start, this was not your typical flight. In this video, we'll try to put together what happened on Flight 295 by using 3 important jigsaw pieces. The story begins in Taipei, with passengers boarding and luggage being put into the airplane. South African Airways operated a version of the 747 known as the Combi, which integrated passengers and cargo on the same deck. The front 2/3 of the gigantic plane were utilized to transport passengers, while the back third was employed for freight. The majority of the passengers were South Africans going home, but there were also several Japanese and Taiwanese nationals on board, as well as others from Europe and Australia. The personnel in the cockpit were quite experienced. The captain was David Ice, a 49-year-old former Air Force pilot with approximately 14,000 hours of flight time. In a matter of hours, he'd be confronted with one of his darkest nightmares, one he'd been secretly worried about for years. First Officer David Hamilton, 36, sat to his right. Hamilton has almost 7,000 hours of cumulative flying experience, approximately 4,000 of which were on the 747. Behind the 2 pilots was Giuseppe Bellagarda, a 45-year-old flight engineer. He, too, had logged thousands of hours flying the 747. This night, he would learn the urgency of the situation. Given the length of the journey, there were 2 more flight crew members in the cockpit, ready to take over for the long ocean cruise. These were Jeffrey Burkill, 37, a relief pilot, and Alan George Daniel, 34, a flight engineer. Everything appeared normal as the crew prepared their large aircraft for takeoff on one of the longest trips in the airline's network. However, if certain versions of this occurrence are to be accepted, something has already gone very wrong. We will soon revisit the potential of this situation. At 10:15 that night, the 747 was moved back from the Taipei gate. The 140 passengers settled down for the lengthy journey as the pilots proceeded to prepare their aircraft for takeoff. The journey to Mauritius would be unusual. In the 1980s, South Africa was considered an international pariah. It was run by an aggressive racist regime, which meant that dozens of countries prohibited it from flying in their airspace. Flights from Europe have to circumnavigate the entire African continent to reach South Africa, and tonight, Flight 295 would be no exception. It would have to fly south across the South China Sea. At 25 minutes past 10 p.m. local time, Flight 295 raced down the Taipei runway and took off into the pitch-black sky. The captain moved the plane south, beginning the long journey to Mauritius. About half an hour after takeoff, the plane reached its initial cruising altitude, which was well above the South China Sea. The pilots continued south on their scheduled path, sending normal location reports to air traffic authorities in Hong Kong, Bangkok, and Kuala Lumpur. So far, everything is going as planned. About 90 minutes after departure, the pilots made a normal call to South African Airways radio station in Johannesburg. This station, called ZUR, was manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, by a South African Airways employee. ZUR's goal was to allow the airline to track its fleet of planes around the world and deal with any issues that arose. The airline regarded it as a crucial service at a time when the country's political environment made overseas operations extremely challenging. In reality, South African Airways was one of just 2 airlines in the world to offer such a service, the other being British Airways. But on this particular night, something out of the ordinary would occur at ZUR. This event would pave the way for the terrifyingly dark interpretation of events we are about to witness. As the pilots conversed in the cockpit, a bar service passed through the passenger cabin. This was quickly followed by a dinner. This way, meals are frequently served on long-haul flights departing late in the evening. Dinner and refreshments are served, after which the passengers sleep till the plane arrives at its destination. Naturally, the pilots did not get to sample the full selection of drink options, but when dinner arrived, they were fed cuisine from the first-class cabin. The pilots expressed dissatisfaction during their meal, citing the food's lack of appeal due to repeated dinners over many years. We know this dinner conversation took place because it was recorded on the cockpit voice recorder for several minutes. However, if you've seen a couple of these movies, you know that the cockpit voice recorder only catches the last 30 minutes of the flight. This is where the flight's first anomaly manifests itself. Flight 295 does not crash within the next 30 minutes. In reality, it will spend the next 8 hours traveling over the southern Indian Ocean. Why is there a discussion about meals being recorded on the cockpit voice recorder? Dinner took place at the beginning of the flight, hours before the jet declared an emergency to Mauritius Air Traffic Control. This is where the first of the 3 puzzle pieces I mentioned previously appears. Let us listen to the audio from the cockpit voice recorder. This indicates the precise time when the cockpit's serene tranquility is interrupted by the first sign of trouble. Don't be deceived by the pilots' calm voices. They were now dealing with the worst kind of disaster an airplane can face, an in-flight fire. If you've seen my movie about Swiss Air Flight 111, you know how rapidly fire can destroy an aircraft. The pilots of Flight 295 immediately went to work, tearing through checklists and attempting to ascertain the origin and cause of the fire before extinguishing it. Within seconds, the size of the flames became clear.
Mauritius, Springbok 295.
Springbok 295, Mauritius, good morning, go ahead.
Good morning, we have a smoke problem and we're doing emergency descent to level 140.
You wish to descend to flight level 140?
Yeah, we have already commenced due to a smoke problem in the airplane.
Roger, you are clear to descend, you need lead to flight level 140.
Roger, we're on the pre-center, if you can alert the fire up.
Do you request a full emergency?
Okay, Joe, can you...
Springbok 295, please, not?
Sorry, go ahead.
Do you request a full emergency, please, a full emergency?
That's Charlie.
Roger, I declare a full emergency, Roger.
Thank you.
Springbok 295, please, not?
Go ahead.
Request your actual position, please, and your DME distance.
We haven't got the DME yet.
Roger, and your actual position, please.
Sorry, come?
Your actual position?
Now, we've lost a lot of electrics. We haven't got anything on the aircraft now.
Roger, I declare a full emergency immediately.
Affirmative.
Roger. Springbok 295, do you have an Echo Tango Alpha please, please? Springbok 295, Plaisance.
Plaisance?
Do you have an Echo Tango Alpha, Plaisance, please?
Yeah, 0030.
Roger, 0030, thank you.
Zet dan oxygen lead.
Sorry, say again, please. Negative 295, say again, please, say again.
We're now 65 miles.
Confirm 65 miles. Roger, Springbok 295, your reclear flight level 50, reclear flight level 50. And Springbok 295, copy actual weather Plaisance, copy actual weather Plaisance. The wind 110 degrees, 05 knots. The visibility above 10 kilometers. And we have a precipitation inside to the north, clouds 5 octaves 1600, 1 octave 5000 feet. Temperature is 22.22 and the QNH 1018 hectopascals, 1018, over. Affirmative, and both runways available if you wish. And 295 for request pilot intention.
We'd like it on 13.
Confirm runway 14.
Charlie.
Affirmative, and you are cleared direct to Foxtrot. You report approaching 50.
Okay.
The flight engineer noted that the popping circuit breakers were caused by fire burning through the electrical wires to which they were connected. It wasn't just cigarette smoke that triggered the smoke alarm. This was rapidly becoming an inferno. The pilot's instruments indicated that the fire had spread to the main deck cargo compartment, just behind the passengers. They had to extinguish it quickly. If they wanted to survive, they needed to act quickly. However, after jumping dozens of circuit breakers, the wires connecting the cockpit voice recorder became the next victim of the fire. This was the last sound caught by the cockpit voice recorder when the fire burned through the cables that powered it. We are currently in the dark regarding our investigation. Within this darkness, there are two possible scenarios, two beacons of light. Where was Flight 295 when the cockpit voice recorder went out of existence? Was it here? Or was it here? To help us answer that question, we'll look at the second of three puzzle pieces. You're about to hear tape of Captain Ice's conversation with an air traffic controller in Mauritius. This is not the same as the previous recording, which was internal cockpit audio. This audio is a tape recording of the Mauritius control tower. The pilots were now around 200 miles from Mauritius, falling fast to 14,000 feet. This audio should certainly settle it. It demonstrates that the plane had traveled all the way across the ocean to Mauritius before the fire began. So, what happened was that the cockpit voice recorder documented the start of the fire around 200 miles from Mauritius, but then the fire cut off the power supply to the recorder, and the pilots began descending and contacting air traffic control. Everything fits. The dinner conversation still poses a challenge. The pilots did not have dinner immediately before starting their descent. However, it appears that the fire started when the pilots were eating their dinner. So, we're left with two options. The dinner conversation describes the fire starting here, whereas the air traffic control recording places it here. Which one might it be? At this point, it's highly likely that the fire originated in the vicinity of Mauritius. After all, the pilots declared an emergency to air traffic controllers there, rather than in Thailand or Malaysia. Captain Ice and his crew were well aware that an onboard fire necessitated an urgent diversion to the next available airfield. Once a fire starts, pilots often have fewer than 20 minutes to land their plane before it is completely devoured by flames. So it is reasonable to assume that the fire occurred near Mauritius, as that is where pilots attempted to land. If the fire had started while the plane was near Asia, it would have sought to divert to Thailand or Malaysia. Or at least, That's how it appears if we remove the third and final jigsaw piece. Near the beginning of this video, I discussed ZUR, a radio outpost operated by South African Airways in Johannesburg. It is staffed 24 hours a day and maintains continuous contact with all the airline's planes worldwide. Fortunately, these chats are recorded on tape. The tape recorders run all day, capturing everything exchanged between the station and the pilots. Maybe we can use this tape to square off the irregularities we've discovered thus far. Maybe it will tell us exactly where the plane was when the pilots became aware of the fire. But here's the issue. The tape from tonight has disappeared. The previous and subsequent nights are safely stored in ZUR. However, the tape that documents the vital moment during which Flight 295 would have been in contact with ZUR has vanished. Why would this critical piece of evidence have vanished? Is this just an unfortunate coincidence, or is there anything on that tape that South African Airways does not want the world to know? When a piece is missing from a jigsaw puzzle, we may still discern its shape in the empty space it left. The absence of the ZUR tape is proof in and of itself, pointing to a worrisome scenario, one that involves two fires. Please keep the following in mind. In 1987, South Africa was embroiled in a brutal conflict with its neighbor Angola. This war required vast amounts of weapons and equipment, but it had a huge flaw. South Africa was under an arms embargo at the time, making it extremely difficult for the military to get the necessary armaments. As a result, the country's authorities did something inconceivable. It began using commercial passenger jets to deliver war weapons. It contracted Armaments Corporation, a military armaments manufacturer, to supply it with missiles, poisons, and other weapons, which it loaded on a passenger aircraft operated by South African Airways. Several high-ranking airline personnel had previously worked for Arms Corporation and were eager to use the aircraft to transport these commodities. Many South African Airways pilots were aware of the practice and disliked it. In reality, in interviews in the years following Flight 295, Captain Ice's wife recounted that on multiple occasions, her husband expressed his concerns about being forced to sign off on cargo that he believed was risky to transport. Importantly, South African Airways violated international law in doing so. If it was discovered to be carrying weapons of war on passenger aircraft, the airline would be doomed. South Africa would be isolated from the rest of the globe. With this established, let us return to the third puzzle piece, the missing ZUR tape, and see where it fits. Let's play out a scenario that fits the evidence. It's the middle of the night, and South African Airways Flight 295 is cruising high above the South China Sea. As the pilots talk, an alert sounds in the cockpit. Smoke comes from a cargo pallet behind the passengers. The pilots quickly began dealing with the problem, going through the checklist to extinguish the fire. The pilot is aware that South African Airways illegally carried firearms on board, which could have triggered this fire. He also understands that if he announces an emergency to air traffic control and makes it to a nearby airport, his jet would be inspected after landing. And he understands that if this inspection reveals illegally transported weapons, the airline is doomed. South Africa's national airline would close, and he would lose his job. As the pilots run through the checklists and try to put out the fire, Captain Eyes must make a decision. If he can extinguish the fire, should he continue to Mauritius or land immediately? He radios ZUR in Johannesburg and requests assistance from the airline. The radio operator confers with senior airline executives, who instruct the captain to extinguish the fire and proceed to Mauritius. They understand that if Flight 295 declares an emergency and lands now, the airline's fate is sealed. In this scenario, the pilots suppress the fire before continuing on to Mauritius, where the fire reignites and spells tragedy a few hours later. Assume that this scenario occurred. Surely, in those critical minutes when the fire first broke out, Captain I's desire to preserve his own and his passengers' lives would take precedence over any abstract political or career reasons. Would he truly put his own life and the lives of over 100 others at risk simply to save his career and his country's airline? Without the ZUR recordings, we don't know what happened this night. The radio operator on duty that night has stated to this day that shortly after the airplane left Taipei, he lost contact with the flight for the remainder of its journey. Others believe it was unusual for an airplane to lose contact for so long. That's why the missing ZIR tapes are so significant. Without them, we don't know if Flight 295 got orders to extinguish the fire and continue the journey, only to have the fire restart as it approached Mauritius, bringing the plane down. We do know that the plane caught fire as it approached Mauritius. The front right pallet in the cargo compartment, just behind the passengers, had caught fire. As the pilots initiated a steep descent, the passengers rushed to the front of the jet to escape the heat and smoke from the blazing flame behind them. A flight attendant ran to the cargo compartment to extinguish the blaze, but dropped their fire extinguisher without ever discharging it because the fire was too large to contain at this point. To prevent harmful smoke and fumes from spreading throughout the aircraft, the pilots turned off the recirculation fans. However, considering the ferocity of the fire and the volume of smoke it produced, turning off the recirculating fans had little influence on the amount of smoke entering the cabin. Several people perished due to carbon monoxide poisoning caused by the smoke that spread throughout the plane. As each techless item failed to stop the fire from spreading, it began to burn through the cabling in the aircraft ceiling, crippling the pilots' instruments one by one. Their plane's sights and hearing were failing as they anxiously attempted to coordinate their arrival with Mauritius Air Traffic Control. They were well over 150 miles away from the airport, and time was running short. As the noxious smoke accumulated within the cabin and cockpit, the pilots reached a point on the fire and smoke checklist that required them to do something unprecedented in a passenger airplane. It instructed them to open a door in mid-flight. With the plane still thousands of feet above the water, a flight attendant hurried to open the front cabin door. Nothing but a black abyss waited outside, accompanied by roaring winds at about 400 kilometers per hour. Whatever relief the passengers had from the smoke did not put out the fire, which was now raging through vital aircraft systems. As air surged past it, the cabin was quite noisy, and the pilots had to shout to communicate. At night, with their instruments malfunctioning, it became increasingly difficult to tell what was going on. The pilots fought as long as they could, but it was a lost battle. The fire had begun to compromise the aircraft structure. Flight 295 broke apart in midair at 7 minutes past 4 a.m. local time, more than 100 miles from the airport. The airplane crashed into the water in 3 pieces and plummeted 14,000 feet below the ocean's surface. There were no survivors. So, what was the reason for the fire? What was stored on the cargo compartment's front right pallet? The official investigation examined sections of the wreckage that had been retrieved from the ocean floor. They were unable to pinpoint the cause of the fire. Fire scientists determined that the fire burned at temperatures much higher than 1,000 degrees Celsius, implying that highly combustible materials were present. So if the physical evidence is inconclusive, what other evidence can we rely on? What about the cargo manifest for the flight, created in Taipei? Well, it was shredded soon after the collision. Nonetheless, another version emerged throughout the investigation, indicating that computer components were assigned to the front right pallet where the fire began. The components included lithium batteries, which are known to be flammable. This would not be the first or last time exploding batteries brought down a passenger jet, but some investigators believe the batteries on this flight were too small to generate such a fire, and they were not known to spontaneously explode. Some fire experts who studied the debris believe that the blaze was so intense that the ignition source required its own oxygen supply. Nothing on the cargo manifest met these criteria, but it wouldn't be the first time South African Airways has snuck dangerous products onto their aircraft without reporting them on the manifest. As a result, conspiracy theories about the true contents of the cargo compartment, as well as others presented in this film, continue to circulate today. If you found this video thought-provoking, please hit the like button. It greatly helps the channel. I'm also curious about your opinions on what might have transpired during this journey. Please share your own theories in the comment section.